So let's start by briefly taking a moment to think about our motivation. So reflecting on the thoughts, the feelings that we had earlier today when we developed an interest in checking out the class, trying to get in touch with what the actual motivation was. And take a moment to see if we can broaden or deepen that motivation. We may have been looking for ways of dealing with stress or having more spaciousness in the mind, but we can also think about what would it mean if I accomplished that goal. How would that be of benefit to those around me? By improving the content of my own mind, how does that empower me to help? And we can try to think that that's also part of my purpose, is to secure those benefits not only for myself, but also for others. So we just try to have a broad motivation where we take into account our impact on others and how we can intentionally cultivate the mind in ways that are beneficial to others. All right. So with that motivation, we will move into the material. For those on Zoom, I believe this might be your first entry into this class, this series. Unfortunately, it is the last of the classes in this series. It's a little confusing because we took last week off because Venerable Rabina was here and she did the Friday night. So that Friday night we skipped. So that might have made it look like that this was the beginning. It's actually the last in the class. Those classes were recorded and they're available on our YouTube channel. So you can, on tnlsf.org, you can easily get to the YouTube channel from the homepage, and then you can look for those recordings. There's just 2 of them. So this is, normally it is a 4-week course, but we had to cancel one of the sessions because of the retreat last weekend. So we're having a shorter 3-week course. So you can get that prior material on the YouTube channel. So but the information I think that we were planning to move into today is still useful and not necessarily dependent on hearing the prior material. What we were going to move into was thinking about so this course, as I've said, I believe I said in the very first iteration of or session of this series, this class is predominantly, its purpose is to help people come away with the information that they need to start a practice on their own, or perhaps to deepen a practice that they have started. And so, in that way, although we do some meditation, there is a informational component as well. So, what we were going to begin discussing were kind of some of the practicalities of setting up that session at home, where to do it, how to do it, that sort of thing. So that's what we will do. So the first aspect of that, of course, when we are meditating at home, it's quite good to try to devote space to that, uh, to where we do that. So most people can't have their own room. That's ideal. Very difficult to do that. Um, but we want to try to think about having a separate or specific place where that is where we go to meditate, wherever it might be. And we could try to think about curtains or tables or something that sort of gives it a separate feel if it's not its own room, which, again, is impractical for most people. And then when we do that in the Buddhist tradition, generally we will set up what's called an altar. You can see an altar behind me. That altar has some cabinet space below it, and then it also has a flat surface on top. The cabinet space can be helpful to store the things that you might use on the altar. It's not strictly necessary to combine the two. It can just be a table, a flat table. Um, the purpose of an altar, and again, this not required. It's entirely up to you to decide. But it serves as the focal point for where a person goes to meditate. Um, the purpose of an altar, I would say, is inspiration, in the sense that it contains typically um, images of enlightened beings, and those represent um, the end goal of Buddhist practice is to also awaken the mind, to become fully awakened. So it serves as reminders of what's possible when we practice. So that's one goal. The other goal is that it can demonstrate to us, if we're doing, if maybe not right away, but maybe eventually we begin to do certain practices that are based around particular enlightened beings. So having images of those enlightened beings show us what that enlightened being looks like. And we may engage in meditations on that enlightened being, uh, which we'll talk a bit about, that kind of visualization meditation. Um, so having the actual images can be very helpful just in being able to visualize when we engage in those practices. And then it serves as a place for us to make offerings. So again, you can see behind me here, these are water bowls here behind me. And so that's also quite common. It's a way of practicing generosity. It's a way of training the mind in generosity to offer water bowls on the altar. Typically, every morning you offer the water bowls, and then every evening you clear the water bowls. There's a text on fpmt.org in the Foundation store called Water Bowl Offerings, Water Bowl Practice. It's called Altar Setup and Water Bowl Offerings. So that if you want to learn more You can go to fpmt.org, go to the foundation store, type in altar setup and water bowl offerings, and then you can get that text, and that will give you a lot of information about various ways of setting up an altar, uh, various ways of doing water bowl practice. Because most we don't necessarily leave our home every day. We don't necessarily find opportunities every day to give. So this is one way. And it's also true that this particular way of offering is in relation to enlightened beings, which is different than making an offering to someone who, might just need money for the bus, or might, that's quite good too. That's a quite good training as well. But it does, this particular way of practicing generosity helps to strengthen our relationship with enlightened beings, enlightened energy, enlightened mind. Which is something that we do for our benefit, not because enlightened energy, enlightened mind is waiting for us and hoping that we make offerings, but that it strengthens our receptivity to enlightened mind, enlightened activity, by creating that kind of relationship through the practice of giving, the practice of generosity. Um, so that's quite good, to have that kind of focal point for one's practice. So, and there's a few, there's um, three required for a traditional Buddhist altar. There's three kind of required elements, and then a fourth generally present element, and that generally present element are the water bowls. They're not strictly required, but they're generally, it's almost ubiquitous. The three things, though, but again, this is just one idea. It's, if you choose to have an altar in your home, then it serves the purpose of your practice, and you should set it up in the way that you find inspiring and that you find moves the mind in a beneficial way. um, but representations of the Buddha's body, speech, and mind are the three, really required elements from this historical Buddhist tradition. Um, so the Buddha's body is represented by a statue here that we have of the Buddha. If a person doesn't have, of course, this is quite an elaborate statue. This is generally, these are about $1,500 or so. These sorts of, there's certainly smaller ones, more humble ones, depending on a person's means, um, that are available. Even a painting or an image of the Buddha could serve that purpose. Um, and then the Buddha's mind is represented with a stupa, which is he. There's different kinds of stupas, but this is one type of stupa. And again, there are smaller ones, different kinds of materials. It represents the Buddha's mind because it it arose. Stupas are now a very broad architectural um, thing thing that you find in many Buddhist countries. Um, and but it rose out of the pile of stones that was a burial marker, a funeral marker. um, and it's the Buddha's, when the Buddha showed the aspect of passing away, that was referred to as the Buddha's final nirvana or peri-nirvana. So that's why his funeral marker, which became more stylized and um, more ornate and more kind of more of a symbol of that parinirvana is the representation of the Buddha's mind, came to represent his parinirvana, his final nirvana. Um, and then I don't think I can point it out, but the on this altar behind me, but the speech of the Buddha would be represented on an altar with a text. So, in the foundation store, again, you can find sutras that you can buy. I believe now the foundation store has moved um, almost entirely to digital. They don't ship too many things anymore. So I don't know for sure if you can buy. I know that Tibetan Spirit, at least last year, haven't checked recently, but they do have sutras that you can purchase and they will ship you. Um, Typically, the traditional way of printing sutras is on what's called pecha, which are these strips of sort of rectangular strips, and it's going to be written in Sanskrit or Tibetan, and so uh, it'll be a stack of these strips where the sutra is written, and then you can get like a box for it, and you'd probably wrap that like in a kata, and put that in a box wrapped in a kata on your altar that represents the teachings that, well, I mean, it is the teachings that the Buddha gave, and all of those teachings were given orally at the time, so that's why it represents the speech of the Buddha. So representations of the Buddha's body, speech, and mind are the three required elements. And then, like I say, the offering bowls are almost always found on the altar as well. And there's always 7 of them, because they represent um, the specific things that you would do because when we meditate, we are. Um, it depends. You can find, if you do sort of the historical practices, there's an element there of invoking enlightened mind, enlightened activity. When you visualize the, your guru in the aspect of Shakyamuni, there's things that you do where you're sort of inviting enlightened mind to be present in the space. And by and so when we invite someone over, there are things that you do. You offer them, historically speaking, if you have an honored guest coming over, you would offer them, the opportunity to shower. You'd offer them you'd give them a drink. You might put on perfume or cologne to make yourself kind of smell nice. You might light incense or, Febreze your room to make it smell nice. You might set out flowers or things to beautify the space. Um, so these water bowls, you might offer them food. You'd offer them a cool drink. So there's things that you do to be respectful of having a guest over and to beautify the environment that you are inviting them into. And that's what these 7 different water bowls represent. They represent water for drinking, water for washing, perfume, light, incense, food, all of these sorts of things. Um, in some in some practices, you have an 8th bowl, but generally not on just the standard altar. The 8th bowl represents music, which again, you might put on some nice music to have a nice environment, but that's only for some specific practices. What they say is that our chanting of the prayers also represents the music offering. So It's not typically represented on a standard kind of normal everyday altar. It's more so added to the altar uh, when there are certain practices that are engaged in. Um, so I'll pause. Any thoughts or questions about anything that we've discussed so far?
A
Yeah.
question.
Mhm.
Is there a difference between the bowls we use in general for offering and like bowls that once develop certain practices you have to use?
So, um, as a practical issue, it's good to talk about that everything that we use for any practice, anything that we use that's part of our practice, we should use only as part of our practice. So that means that like the altar that we use, it shouldn't be like the dining room table that you turn into your altar when you're going to meditate, and then you take it down and then it becomes your dining room table again. Um, and anything that we use, we want to use exclusively for our practice. So again, so your water bowls, they shouldn't be like your dessert bowls that you then like, that you also might, you're like, oh, I have company coming over and I need to have dessert bowls. So let me, take these and also use them. Um, but in terms of and even I would say even the things that we use to fill the water bowls and even the things that we use to empty the water bowls, we also that I mean that can be very simple. You can get like a simple plastic pitcher and a simple plastic like bucket, but it should only be ever used for filling and emptying those, your water bowls. If a person sometimes does a puja or some other, where there's a more elaborate setup, um, then it can be exactly the same. You would just get more of them. It doesn't. They don't have to be. I mean, it kind of. They could also be smaller. It doesn't have to be. It really can be either. Um, there's some value in if you're going to do water bowl offerings every single day, then you might want those 7 bowls, you might want them, because I mean, you can see these bowls are, they're not small, um, but it's also true. They don't. It also is true that they don't have to be sold as Tibetan Buddhist offering bowls. You can find those if you go on Tibetan Spirit, or you go, if you just Google, you can find Tibetan Buddhist offering bowls. And that doesn't have to be what you choose to use. I think these are probably just like crystal bowls. Um, and so the thing about traditional offering bowls is that they are actually generally quite small. I would say they fit in the palm of your hand generally, and these are a bit larger. There's some value in having it be a little bit larger, because then you make a bigger offering. Um, but as a practical matter, if you're maybe, let's say you're going to do the medicine Buddha puja, like you just decide, okay, I want to be able to do medicine Buddha puja at home. I mean, maybe you don't, but you need 56 bowls to do medicine Buddha puja at home, because you need 8 rows of 8. And so it's not practical to use really big bowls unless you're just have a huge room. And I mean, it's great if you want to do that, but you may want to get smaller bowls for that. Um, I would say if you're going to do like Guru Puja at home, which is a little bit more practical because that's 10, that altar setup is 10 bowls rather than 7. Um, then I would say you want to get three more of the same size or 10 separate. You do whatever you do want all of the bowls to be the same size. You don't want some to be one size and others to be a different size all at the same time. I think visually that's not so good. That doesn't look good for the mind. It's a little odd. It would kind of, I don't think that's good. So you want to get enough that whatever you're doing, they are all the same size. Did you have a specific way that you were thinking of your question that I didn't talk about?
No, that's exactly what I was thinking of. Like I was thinking prospectively, like if I had to buy like another set of bowls eventually for offering.
Yeah, I would say as long as so and you can also, I think it's fine if they're different, if you've got, if you're doing a bigger practice and they don't all, you're going to just have like a separate table where, because you're doing a puja or something, then I would say all of the bowls on that table should be the same size. But if the bowls on your altar, which is a separate thing, those can be a different size. Um, because as long as it's two, I mean, that's what I did during the pandemic. I got bowls to do medicine Buddha puja so I could do it on Zoom, but so I could set it up. And I just got a whole separate set, and there was just a side, it was a separate table. Because I mean, 50s, it really actually doesn't have to be that, doesn't really actually take up that much space. It's a little expensive because they're like $3 or $4, each. And so, but I mean, to think about what's practical. Um, so yeah. And I would say the other thing to think about practically is a lot of the traditional bowls are metal, and you can see that these are glass or crystal. I prefer glass or crystal because the metal, it's difficult to keep clean. It's difficult because you're holding water in them for 12, 14 hours a day every day, and they tend to oxidize, and then they don't look good, and then it kind of disturbs the mind to be filling bowls that look discolored, that don't look, you want it to be beautiful, you want it to move the mind in a positive direction. And glass and crystal doesn't oxidize. um, if you want to, you could seal the metal. There's things you can buy, if you want to go that route, you can. um, but the bowls themselves are generally not sealed, and they will oxidize. They will discolor, and I don't personally, I don't like that. So that's just my advice. Is uh, glass or crystal, or if you want to get a polish or something and seal them, you can. Any other questions? Okay, so that is about setting up the place where you're meditating, and then the session has parts to it if you're going to do a particular session of meditation. The first step in that process is to survey where you're going to meditate, and just take a look and see if it looks orderly, if it looks kind of neat. Um, and if not, then, and so typically people would dust the altar every day. They would dust the statues on the altar every day. And then, you would look around and you might vacuum, you might, just kind of make sure that everything seems clean and neat and orderly before, just kind of as step number one. And then step number two would be to set out the water bowl offerings. There's other things that you can offer on an altar as well. Incense is an offering. I mean, if you guys want to go into like the process of offering, I can go into it if that's of interest. Um, Incense is an offering in and of itself. It's also generally part of um, setting out the water bowl offerings, because you typically incense the bowls as a way of purifying them, cleaning them, with the incense. Um, So making offerings of incense, having light, you can see that there's light built in to the table, here behind me. Uh, Another way of making light offerings is having the strings of light. Those can be the flexible sort of metal. I like because you can kind of wrap those around the statues and things. The thicker kind of ropes are a little bit less wieldy. They're a little bit more awkward. The thin kind of metal ones are nice to work with. I don't of course, you can use small candles, votive candles and things like that. Um, but of course, I don't recommend lighting those and then going to work. I don't want anyone to burn their house down. So please don't, think about doing that sort of light offering. Um, so I would say that you really, you can do that if you're sure that you're going to be around, and that it's really, really, really safe. Um, I don't Personally, I don't like blowing out the offering, because it's a light offering, right? So I don't personally really like lighting something and then doing a practice and then blowing it out, because then you're sort of taking away the light offering. It's I like having the electric lights that if it doesn't bother anyone, you could just leave it up 24 hours a day as an offering. If you do need to turn it off because you need to go to bed and it's going to prevent someone from being able to fall asleep, then of course, it's because it's similar to taking the water bowl offerings down. Of course, you're going to do that. So at the same time, you could turn off the lights if you need to. If it's not going to bother anyone, you can leave them up as an offering 24 hours a day also. Um, offering light, offering incense, offering food is another option. And of course, this would be something that you're subsequently going to eat. It doesn't have to, you don't throw it away. You make an offering of it, maybe for a day, maybe, and then fruit, maybe snacks that are non-perishable, things that don't have to be refrigerated. You could make an offering for one day, or 2 days, and then take it down and eat it. Subsequent to that, certainly you wouldn't waste it. That's not the idea. But you're going to buy fruit. You're going to buy, and so why not make an offering of it first before you eat it? Um, so yeah, so light. Oh, and also flowers is a very common. Yep, see here, flowers, flowers on the altar. That's a quite good offering. You want to remove the flowers when they start to droop, when they start to not be so pleasant to look at. If you want, you can just, you could put them somewhere else in your house, but you don't want to keep them on the altar when they've started to decline, because that's not such a good offering at that point. You don't have to necessarily completely chuck them at that moment, but you want to take them off the altar and not have them as an offering, because it's, that's where you're meditating and that's what you're going to see, and it's not going to move the mind in a good direction. um, yeah, light, flowers, incense, food. So, and again, those are the same kinds of things that are represented in the water bowls, but you're just actually offering them in a separate way. So you clean the space, you set out offerings, and then you take your seat, your meditation seat. At this point, you would do what's called setting your motivation, which we did at the very beginning of the session. There are formal ways of doing that, which we did not do at the beginning of the session. If you're interested in looking at some of those formal ways, then you can, there's a text, again, fpmt.org. They have a text called um, daily prayers. So you can use daily prayers um, to as a way of looking at what are called the preliminary prayers, and then also we'll talk about dedication. So you can look at if you want to set your motivation in a very formal way, but generally the idea is that you want to, like we did do, you want to create a more expansive motivation. You want to think about that the purpose of your session of meditation is not just for oneself, but that you're trying to create um, tendencies and habits that are of benefit for others as well. Um, so you can do that however is comfortable for you, but you want to really intentionally set a positive motivation. So after you've done that, then you engage in the actual session of meditation, which we've talked in the previous classes about the different kinds of meditation that are an option. Could be an analytical meditation where you are trying to. We've talked about the two different kinds of analytical meditations. Some of them are their purpose is to help you understand more about what is true according to the Buddha about how things function. So that might be like a meditation on impermanence. You're trying to understand that things are in the nature of impermanence. You're trying to um, create a sense, a wisdom in your mind. You're trying to see things more clearly by engaging in that analytical meditation over and over. You will begin to live from a place of that intuitive understanding that things are impermanent, which we're not so good at. We need to expose ourselves to that wisdom again and again because it doesn't come naturally to us. It's not something that we are familiar with. Meditation, as we said in the first class, it's the process of becoming familiar with a virtuous object. Um, Other kinds of analytical meditation, they are not designed to give you wisdom about the way that things are. They are designed to help you um, to be to have your own mind uh, be imbued with a virtuous quality. So that would be, for example, a meditation on compassion. Compassion is the wish for oneself and all sentient beings to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. That doesn't the world is not set up, that's not something that's true about the world. Impermanence is something that is true about the nature of all things, but compassion is not. Compassion is a choice. Compassion is a state of mind that we can intentionally cultivate, or we can choose not to intentionally cultivate. um, and so, what you're trying to do with the meditation on compassion is to generate your mind in into compassion, into a spontaneous, deep, abiding way of constructively relating to others from a place of compassion. Um, so that would be another kind of analytical meditation. Um, so, whatever it might be, you engage then in a session of meditation. We've talked about how you want to keep those sessions quite short, for a good amount of time, because we want to be able to concentrate well. We want to be able to hold the object, the meditation object. We want to be able to hold it very vividly, very clearly, in a very stable way, which means not giving in to the arising of distraction. We can't prevent the arising of distraction, but we can notice the arising of distraction and move the mind back to the object. The goal of that being over time, we get really good at holding the mind with fewer and fewer distractions, um, to the object that we are intending to concentrate the mind on. Um, so, yeah, I forget where I was going with that, but so um, that's one aspect of meditation, is getting better at the ability to concentrate the mind on the chosen object. And then, so you know, we do like a 10-minute meditation, 15-minute meditation, and we stick to that, for months and months and months, for maybe a couple of years, until we really notice that there's a lot of progress being made, and that there aren't very many distractions. They're not very intense. And then we can start to add time to that. But we don't want to just jump right into, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, because that's not productive. That's too difficult to try to maintain that focused awareness for long periods of time. And, right from the beginning, we want to get there eventually, but we want to do it in a very gradual, intentional, uh, reasonable, step by step way, of focusing the mind, you know, by pushing ourselves, but pushing ourselves slowly. Otherwise, it's just sort of daydreaming, and it's too difficult. It's too intense for the mind to remain concentrated like that. So then we end. We decide ahead of time if it will be 10 minutes, if it will be 15 minutes, and then quite good to try to stick to that and not just give up when we, because there's a lot of frustration in the beginning, which is also something that we should really try to, not give into. Just like when you go to the gym, you understand that you're going to go there to lift something heavy a bunch of times and put it down a bunch of times and do that over and over again. And you know that going in. It's not surprising that it's a heavy weight. It's not surprising that you have to do it over and over again. That's what your expectation is. So we should go into our session of meditation understanding that distractions will arise, and that when they arise, our job is to notice them and move the mind back to the intended object. And then another distraction will arise, and then we move our mind back to the intended object. And that's what we should anticipate is the process of getting better at concentrating. Just like lifting heavy things over and over again is the process for getting better at our physical health. So if we go into it with that expectation, we won't, we'll experience less frustration. We're like, oh, of course, this is what I anticipated. I'm not, it's not some sort of weird, unwanted condition that I'm experiencing. This is the nature of how this is meant to go. So we want to really not, say that we're going to do 15 minutes and then after 5 kind of say, oh, well, this is too difficult, this is too frustrating, and so we give up. We might decide that 15 is not the right goal for us. Maybe we need to decide, okay, going forward, 5 or 7 is a better goal. But whatever we decide, we want to really try to have the discipline of sticking to that for that session. Um, and so then that session comes to an end, and then we do what's called dedicating. And again, this is something that we can do in a very formal way. And again, in that text, FPMT's daily prayers, there are examples of formal dedications, which, it's a really beautiful dedication practice, is a very beautiful practice. It can be the ways in which we can dedicate our practice can be incredibly beautiful and expansive, where, but the overall goal is to prevent our ego from co-opting what we've done. We've done something useful, virtuous, positive, but we don't want to allow our ego to get involved in that process and give rise to thoughts of, oh, I'm amazing. I just did a session of meditation. Everybody else that I know is being lazy, and they're watching TV and they don't care about this kind of thing, but I do because I'm better than them. And we don't want to start going down that really destructive, egoistic way of thinking. So at the end of our session of meditation, we want to think about just giving away whatever we accomplish. We want to think that, I want that to ripen for the benefit of all other sentient beings, and not think of it as, I did this thing for myself. And so how great, am I that I did that? We want to just offer the fruit of our practice for other sentient beings. So there's many different, and so just like the preliminary prayers, you would do that in whatever way felt right for you. You can write out, prayers. You can think about people that who are sick or who are struggling, and think, that this positive energy is of benefit to them. um, you can do it in whatever way feels good, for you to have a sense of offering the fruit of your practice for other sentient beings, so that you're not getting caught up in what you're doing, and it's not feeding your own kind of uh, concretized sense of self. um, so those are the parts of any session of meditation: the cleaning the space, setting out offerings, adjusting your motivation, engaging in the actual session, and then dedicating your practice. Um, and so you can do that in really brief ways. If you're going to do, maybe a couple sessions in a day, you could do a really expansive dedication at the end of the day, and briefer dedications, the other sessions. It can really be whatever. Or if you have more time on the weekends, then you can do things in a more expanded way and do things in a briefer way. But, generally, you don't want to skip entirely setting your motivation or dedicating. You want to try to include that in every session of meditation. Any thoughts or questions? Um, the two types of analytical versus stabilization. Um, is there a process to determine which type maybe we should do in a given situation? Is there a protocol on that? So the question from the Gompa was, in relation to the different kinds of meditation, the different types of meditation. How might we decide which to do, or what kinds to do? Um, and so I would say that in general, um, there's, a person's practice belongs to them, and so there isn't a right answer, for that. um, I would say that it really depends on that person's own goal. um, if some people eventually decide that their goal is to practice Buddhism for the purpose of achieving enlightenment, Other people aren't interested in that, or maybe not now, maybe not ever. That doesn't become their goal. And so that's going to determine, in a way, what a person is including in their practice. Many people might um, just be interested in cultivating positive states of mind. Um, so it really depends on, what a person's goal is. I would say that including sessions of meditation that are purely stabilizing, meaning using the breath, using a visualization, um, those are important if a person really wants to make progress in meditation, really wants to take it very seriously over a long period of time. Then we want to have sessions that are not where there's no analysis happening, because those are particularly well suited for developing a concentrated mind. So we'll make progress in developing concentration faster if in a given week we've included, 3 or 4 sessions that are purely stabilizing, whereas as opposed to thinking all of my sessions need to be analytical. Um, but so a really good book, 2 really good books to start with are both written by Venerable Sangye Kadro, but her her pen name is her birth name, which is Kathleen MacDonald. So she just doesn't write under her ordained name, or at least she didn't at the time that these. I think she had taken ordination when these had come out, but I'm not sure. I could be wrong about that. But How to Meditate and then Awakening the Kind Heart. These are both written by Kathleen MacDonald or Venerable Sangye Kadro. They're both available, as they say, wherever books are sold. And they're really great for showing you a variety of examples of kinds of meditations that you might choose to include. Um, Once a person becomes really serious about, I mean, if not when, but if a person chooses to become really serious about using meditation as a tool to achieve enlightenment, then what's called the lam rim becomes more of a focal point of a person's practice, because the lam rim in English uh, is stages of the path to enlightenment, and the lam rim contains the specific realizations that transform ordinary mind into enlightened mind. And so and they contain things like impermanence and loving kindness, and but they also include more detailed, more specific things. So if the person decides that at some point that they take that as their goal, then that really becomes the main source of a person's meditation, are the lam rim contemplations. Any other? So we'll talk then about a little bit about visualization meditation, which I alluded to when I mentioned that there are practices um, commonly that you find in Tibetan Buddhism where we visualize particularly enlightened beings, like Shakyamuni Buddha and um, other enlightened beings. So the reason that we might do that, it's really kind of maybe you could say alternative, or maybe you could say supportive way of meditating on these positive mental states that we're trying to develop. So um, we can meditate on trying. I've used compassion as a prior example. So one analytical way of meditating on compassion would be to visualize. Well, I don't know if this is complicating it, because this is also visual, but this also gives you a sense of the power of visualization in meditation. Um, so, a way of visualizing that doesn't depend on enlightened beings would be commonly the friend, enemy, and stranger meditation, which can be used in a variety of different ways. Um, and enemy here is a strong word, but that's typically what they use. It means difficult person, person that we that agitates us, that disturbs our mind in some way. Doesn't mean like mortal enemy, but difficult person. So when we use friend, difficult person, and stranger in a variety of different contexts, the purpose of it is to generalize positive mental states, like love, like compassion, because we our minds are already to some degree familiar with love and compassion. We are not totally um, these are not totally foreign concepts to us. Uh, but from the Buddhist perspective, the difficulty or the challenge is that although we have some familiarity, it is not as deep or as stable as it could be, as our minds are capable of embracing that realization. So if we think about our parent, or our family member, our child, our best friend, if we think about someone like that, and we think about a suffering that they are experiencing, we'll find it relatively easy to wish that they were not suffering in that way. Or even we could think of our own suffering. Um, we can think about, maybe we often get migraines, or we sometimes have anxiety, or we sometimes have depression, or we find something quite challenging, something that some work situation that we find a suffering experience. When we recollect it, we find it quite easy to wish, I don't want this. I wish this was not happening to me. And we find that generally also quite easy for our loved ones. But we find it more difficult to have that deep, spontaneous, natural sense when we're thinking of, our waiter at a restaurant, or the person driving up next to us in their car. They too experience anxieties, depression, struggles with work, maybe health issues, but we don't really think about that so much. When these sorts of people appear in our day, we only think about them if they in some way are hindering, if they're cutting in front of us, or if they're being slow to serve us, they're hindering what we would like to get out of our day. Or we might think, if are they say a nice thing, or they show consideration, then the mind is moved in a positive direction, and we're like, oh, that was really nice of them. And we start to have a, a positive way of relating to them. But mainly, if they're just kind of walking next to us, they're not hindering us, they're not benefiting us, and they're just kind of the person that's next to us. And we have no awareness of their struggles, their difficulties. Um, and so if we, if they were, let's say, you know, maybe on crutches, or maybe they were sneezing, or they seem to be in some distress, our mind wouldn't really deeply, naturally, spontaneously go toward, oh, I really hope that they are free of this illness. I really hope that they have a state of deep, abiding well-being. They're just kind of like, I hope they don't cough on me. I hope I don't get sick, or we just sort of, you know, or we're just thinking about where we need to go, what we need to do, and they're just sort of in the background. And that, from the Buddhist perspective, is an obstacle to unlocking, uncovering our own potential for really expansive, positive states of mind. And even more difficult is to have that way of relating to someone who we think of as having had persistent tendencies that we find harmful, that they've acted at cross purposes to what we want. That would be the difficult person. People who routinely seem to be short-tempered, they seem to be you know acting against our interests in some way. We find it when they experience a difficulty, a suffering, we might even take some solace in that. We might actually think, oh, good, they're getting what they deserve. They're not a nice person, and so they deserve to have something difficult happen to them. We might actually rejoice when something unpleasant happens to them. And that, from the Buddhist perspective, is a much deeper kind of obstacle to our own unlocking. Okay, I might have to. This isn't going to be as good, I'm sorry, but this sometimes happens. I don't know why. Um, okay, so what I was saying is, so because we do have the seed of positive mental states in the mind already, we can tap into that by visualizing friend, enemy, and stranger in front of us. And we can visualize that our friend is experiencing a suffering, and then the wish for them to be free of it will spontaneously arise in the mind. And we then can remember subjectively what that was like when we imagine that a stranger is experiencing a similar kind of obstacle, a similar kind of suffering. And we can um, then just go back to literally, what did it feel like? What was my subjective mental state when I had true, genuine compassion? And we kind of pretend, in a way, that we have it for the stranger, just by recollecting it and kind of intentionally directing it, even if we're kind of pretending, even if we're kind of faking it in the beginning. And then we're going to find it even more difficult for the enemy, the difficult person. But still, we can remember, when I did have it, what did it feel like? What thoughts were arising? What was the subjective mental state? And then we can just sort of try to intentionally direct that to that person in the meditation session. And even though it's contrived and it's sort of artificial and it's sort of forced, what Buddhism would say, if we do that a lot, it becomes less and less contrived. It becomes more and more genuine over time. And so that's the process that we can use for generalizing these positive mental states. Um, but so that's one way of analytically stabilizing and deepening compassion, let's say. The supportive or alternative way is to visualize an enlightened being who is the embodiment of compassion, the embodiment of that positive mental state. So in Tibetan Buddhism, that would be Chenrezig or Avalokiteshvara, which is just Chenrezig is the Tibetan name, Avalokiteshvara is the Sanskrit name, but they're referring to the same enlightened being. And this kind of practice, I always phrase it as that it's sort of like a memory palace that, where if you're trying to memorize a list of things, you would take like the first letter of each of the list of things, and then you would visualize a room where, there was a couch, and then the couch reminds you of the word that begins with C that you're trying to memorize. So you build this visualization in your mind where these things represent these other things that you're trying to remember. The enlightened beings are like that, in that the kind of implements that they're holding, the way that they are dressed, all of the aspects of the visualization, they represent aspects of of that particular quality of enlightened mind. And then there's also a mantra typically that goes along with each enlightened being. And that, I mean, mantra is a little bit more esoteric in the sense that it's kind of thought to work on an energetic level of the mind. It's a bit deeper. It's meant to kind of embody that energy in a more energetic way. But typically, you would recite the mantra of that enlightened being while visualizing them and visualizing that their energy is merging with your mind, your body. Um, so it's, it can take, some people don't resonate with that, which is of course fine. It can take time to resonate with that. Uh, but it's just to say that that is quite a powerful way of meditating on also compassion that supports the analytical way of meditating on compassion. So there's many different kinds of, we at the center, we do on Tuesday nights, we do, it's a little bit more advanced because they're hour-long practices, but we do a meditation on Chenrezig, we do a meditation on healing aspect of enlightened mind, which is called medicine Buddha. We do a meditation on Tara. Tara is the female aspect of enlightened energy that represents kind of like the mother aspect, kind of like the fierce determination to overcome problems for their children. That kind of energy is what Tara represents. Um, so we draw ourselves closer to that energy by engaging in these supportive practices. Um, and it's a very rich tradition in Tibetan Buddhism of engaging in these visualization practices. Any thoughts or questions about visualization?
A question.
Yes, Aaron.
Um, what does it mean that we have an affinity for a deity?
Oh, now yeah, this happens when I switch my input, it screws up my speaker. So now, unfortunately, we're going to have to utilize the chat because I'll have to leave and come back and restart. This happens I apologize, my speakers stop working when this happens. When I switch my input, it also screws up maybe I don't know if I can fix it because no, it's correct. It's correct on Zoom, but it doesn't work. I'm sorry. What does it mean to have an affinity? So it could be that it's that it's an indication of past practice, that maybe in a past life that we engaged in a lot of practice for that. There's what's called a yidam in Tibetan Buddhism, which well, the idea of like one's own yidam, meaning like which is specifically related to highest. So generally speaking, a lot of these visualization practices, they they are connected to Vajrayana meditation in general, and there are different levels of Vajrayana practice. Um, Highest yoga tantra is the category of that. As I mean, Aaron knows this, but not necessarily other people. Highest yoga tantra is the classification of tantric practice that is specifically designed to lead to enlightenment. The other lower levels are designed to help create conducive conditions, but not directly leading a person to enlightenment. That's what highest yoga tantra practice does. And so within that sphere of practice, there's generally kind of an interest. People have an interest in finding what's called like their yidam, which means kind of the the specific enlightened being that would be the fastest and easiest vehicle for oneself to use to achieve enlightenment, because these tantric systems are different. They have because people's subtle energy systems are different. There are different tantric systems. So they all will lead a person to enlightenment, but there's this idea that, if you can find your yidam, then that's the best way to do it. Oftentimes, you would try to find like a really highly qualified teacher to tell you, because you might not, it's hard to know. Um, but I would say if you gravitate, if you find yourself gravitating to a particular practice, it could be that that is related to your yidam, in terms of highest yoga tantra, but it could also just be that you've practiced that in the past. Um, and so all of the things that we've done in the past, karmically speaking, are going to feel more familiar. That's like as Venerable Rubino was saying, karmically speaking, there's the result, similar to the cause in my action. So when we have the result similar to the cause in our action, then we will kind of fall back into that groove that's in the mind. So that can be positive or negative. If we do a lot of stealing in a past life, then we're going to find the impulse to steal is going to be there to some degree in the mind. And we're going to have to fight against that impulse. But if we've meditated on Chenrezig a lot in our past life, then that's going to feel familiar. That's going to feel, we're going to gravitate toward that. So I would take it as that, as an indication of that in general. Any other questions? So, people often think that, that they're uniquely bad at visualizing, and that might turn them off to this whole idea. Um, but I think we mentioned maybe in the first class, if the instruction was to visualize a pizza above the crown of your head instead of an enlightened being, you would find that quite easy, because you're deeply familiar already with the smell of a pizza, the taste of a pizza, the appearance of a pizza. You could very easily, very vividly cause that to appear floating above the crown of your head. But Shakyamuni Buddha, that's going to be less easy to do. But it's only because of the force or lack of force of past familiarity, past past habit. So we can, just by reading these descriptions, by having representations, we can make progress in getting to a point where Shakyamuni would appear just as vibrantly, just as vividly, just as concretely, as a pizza now is something that we could make appear. So it's not true that we are uniquely poor at visualizing. It's just that we've not developed that same level of familiarity with the images of enlightened beings that we have developed with the everyday things that we come across in our experience, because it's from a different culture and we haven't really been exposed to it in the same way. Okay, let's see. I have a few more minutes. Let's see. Is there anything that would be that a person, maybe they came with uh, a personal interest or issue or question that they would like addressed in any way? Again, if you're on Zoom, I'm sorry, you'll have to type it. Okay to meditate or pray standing towards the altar. So, in general, um, when we, it's kind of high. I mean, I think it's fine for it to be high. We actually, we kind of want it to be somewhat high because you do want it to be at a respectful height. They say that when you are seated, if you were to take a seat on the floor um, before your altar, you would want the heads of the enlightened beings to be, certainly above your own head. So you don't want a very low altar. You want your head to come to a place that's below, which you can see why, even on this, we've elevated none of these are directly on the altar. They've been elevated. None of the, and the central figure, you want Shakyamuni to be, if you have other enlightened beings, you want Shakyamuni Buddha to be the central figure on there as well. So you want that to be higher, and so that everything else is lower, to represent that all of the teachings came from Shakyamuni, and that he is the revealer of the path. Um, so, I mean, in general, because meditation is also has this component of developing focused attention, we, that's why they talk about the full Vajra position, where you, or at least the most stable seated position that you can get your body into. Because if we're standing, then the body is quite, there's a lot of muscle involvement and the body's quite rigid. So I would say, it isn't something that you'd have to completely avoid altogether, but that when we're seated in a very stable position, we're kind of allowing the mind to go in and then the body to relax in conjunction with the mind becoming more subtle. There's going to be a relaxation response that happens in the physical body as the mind withdraws and the mind becomes more subtle. So certainly there are practices like prostrations, the 35 confession Buddhas, that is typically done standing. I mean, when we do it here at the center, of course, when we do that every night, then the teacher is seated because just as a practical, it's easier to hear that person. But actually, the text itself, ideally, you are standing and you are facing the altar, and ideally you're doing full length prostrations as you're reciting, as you're going through the sadhana. So certainly there are practices that are like that. But when we're cultivating a real meditation practice, on a day-to-day, thing, we want to account for the relaxation response that happens when the mind goes inward and the mind becomes more subtle. Um, and so that's why we put the body in a really stable position at the beginning, and we try to hold that really stable position so that we relax into that position. And even then, the body doesn't kind of flop over. It doesn't, it just relaxes into a stable position that we've already established. Um, that's kind of the hope. So they only talk about traditional meditation posture as being seated. So, doing it from time to time, completely, no problem. But on a day-to-day thing, we want to account for that relaxation response, and so seated is better. Anything else that would just be of interest or of personal interest or personal potential benefit? I can't guarantee any benefit, but there's always a chance. So yeah, I don't know. There isn't anything similar in Tibetan Buddhism to yoga or kind of energetic practices. There just isn't a corollary in Tibetan Buddhism to though, because yoga is a Hindu practice and Tai Chi is a Chinese practice. You don't find a corollary that involves there's walking meditation. I mean, that is a thing. It's not, you don't actually find it emphasized in Tibetan Buddhism so much. You find it in other Buddhist traditions. I mean, it's not to say that in Tibetan Buddhism they deny that it's a thing, but it's not really emphasized. It's not really presented as, and it has, walking meditation has a purpose, in that it helps to present kind of obstacle in a way. You are creating more visual, you're kind of trying to maintain, because I mean, ultimately, when a person, the reason why I would say that for general training, like being seated is best, is because it's the most conducive way of getting to focused attention. Um, Challenging yourself, giving yourself, you know, less conducive experiences can be a way of deepening focused attention. And walking meditation, it's kind of presenting a busier environment. You're learning to integrate mindfulness with physical movement, but as a technique, you don't really find Tibetan teachers so much talking about it or so much integrating it. Not the historical Tibetan teachers so much, and no corollary to energetic. I mean, in highest yoga tantra, which is energetic practice, there are some movements, where they're kind of trying to activate, kind of, they do sort of like this sort of, like there's things that they do, but they're seated, they're still kind of seated things, and there's no total system of energy movement practice like you find in other cultures. There just isn't. Anything else? Meditating lying down. It is a posture that the Buddha taught. So you find, it's an option. It's generally not ideal because we typically associate lying down with drowsiness. We typically associate it with falling asleep. And we certainly want to have the body relaxed, but we want to have the mind very sharp, very focused, very alert. Um, and so for us, broadly speaking, it's not as advisable. It is something that if a person was ill and they didn't want to skip their practice, and they really had no choice, then they could do it lying down. Um, um, Other than kind of it being a last resort because of some kind of illness that's happening, um, it's generally something that we're advised to kind of not get into the habit of doing. It could be if you want to kind of utilize going to sleep, if you want to actually make that a virtuous thing, then of course you are lying down. And if you want to kind of immediately before you fall asleep, if you want to do a short meditation, then you could certainly do that. But typically, in the middle of the day, if everything was going well and things were normal, um, I wouldn't advise a person to just lay down and do their practice. It's generally not ideal. With walking, so generally with walking meditation, as I as it's as I've come across it, it's mainly to mainly you are concentrating on just literally like, you usually have a slightly downward gaze. So you're not, so you want to do that in a really safe place, not like next to the road, or because generally you're not looking around. You're really trying to maintain a constrained um, way of being. So you're kind of looking down at where you're going. Um, and so the the purpose is more so about moving in a very slow, very deliberate. So really paying attention to every foot movement, every arm movement, um, and then just attending to what's directly in front of you. It's a way of kind of embodying presence, kind of momentary awareness presence. Um, and that's really how it's used in how I've seen it used, is that it's a way of concentrating on the present moment, um, by attending to being really slow and really deliberate, and just focusing on what's happening in front of you as it's happening in front of you. Um, so you want to do that like in your backyard or in your living room. And typically people will just walk in a circle. They'll just walk in a circle, in a safe space. Um, but we're just a little bit out of time, unfortunately. So next Friday, we're starting a new, it's called Introduction to Mindfulness, that Stephen will be doing on Friday nights. So that's coming up on the Friday nights in February. So that's the next kind of introductory thing. And that will be a 4-week course. So that should be great. And it will be happening here at the center for people who are local. Um, yeah. But so we do dedicate at the end of our classes. So again, so think back to the motivation that you established, where you tried to have a broader altruistic motivation and think that you listened and participated with the goal of actualizing that motivation, and that has created positive energy in the mind. So again, as we've said, the purpose of dedication practice is to give that positive energy away. So think about that positive energy ripening for the benefit of others, thinking about giving away the fruit of your practice and thinking that it is beneficial to countless sentient beings, that positive energy, just in whatever way works for you. All right. Well, thanks for coming. And like I said, you can find the previous classes in this series on the YouTube channel. We talked about other things too. But yeah, thanks so much. Have a great night.